Hello and welcome on board this crowd science flight of fancy. I'm Marnie Chesterton and I'll be your pilot for this forthcoming journey. We do realise that you had a range of carriers available to you, and the BBC World Service would like to thank you for choosing to travel with us. We'll be taking a route via several listener questions linked by a food and travel theme, so expect astronaut meals and high-flying altitude flavourings to make an appearance. Assisting me in this endeavour are Professor Charles Spence from the Cross-Modal Research Laboratory at Oxford University, but currently on the line from Columbia. Say hello, Charles.
Hello, everyone.
And from Leeds University and also visiting fellow at Steno Diabetes Centre Copenhagen is Dr. Christine Beaulieu, lecturer in appetite and obesity. Say hello, Christine.
Hi, everyone.
Seatbelts on, it's time to relax, sit back and enjoy the next half hour. So the first stop on the trip is a big and important question. It's from Jacqueline.
Hello, Crowd Science. My name is Jacqueline and I live in Toronto, in Canada. My questions are about hunger. What happens in my body when I feel hungry? Why does the feeling of being hungry sometimes go away after a while even if I don't eat anything? And why do I sometimes feel like I want to eat even if I don't feel hungry?
Christine, I'm coming to you on this one. What is this feeling?
So in my field of research, hunger is actually defined as the drive to consume in response to a biological need. So it's our body telling us that we need food to replenish our energy stores or to sustain our bodily functions. And our research at the University of Leeds shows that our overall hunger stems from a drive to eat, and that's determined by a resting metabolic rate, which is the energy that our body expends to sustain our everyday bodily functions, and to a lesser extent by our physical activity levels. But there's also a episodic mechanism, so on a meal-to-meal basis, signals such as an empty stomach, low blood glucose, and appetite-related hormones can also trigger or signal hunger. So all these signals work together to tell our appetite center in the brain that we feel hungry. So it's a very complex system.
So even though you kind of feel it as this thing in your stomach, it's actually it's your brain.
We'll feel it in our stomach, but then that will relay the messages to our appetite center in the brain. So that's in the hypothalamus, and that will tell our body that we need to seek food.
And what about if you feel hungry and then you don't eat and it goes away, even though you haven't responded to that feeling of hunger?
So hunger feelings can go away after a while. So during prolonged fasting or in kind of food deprivation situations, our body produces ketone bodies, and these have been proposed to suppress appetite. But this is really early days in that area of research. Hunger is not only influenced by internal factors, but also external factors. And we can forget that we're hungry under some circumstances because we're distracted or that we're busy.
Oh, wow. So, I think it might be quite hard for certain people, myself included, to forget that they're hungry. But I like that idea that you can just distract someone and they will be distracted from the messages saying, hey, you need to eat.
Some people love to eat and they're very in tune with their hunger sensation. So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of comment.
And Jacqueline was asking why sometimes does she feel like she wants to eat and she knows she's not hungry?
So we have several appetite systems in the brain, and one of them is the hedonic system. Even though we're not hungry, we can still want to eat because we have that pleasure system in the brain, which can override these sensations of fullness, for example. So let's say, for example, we're at a restaurant and we see the dessert menu, but we've just had the big meal and we're full, but we still want that dessert because it's so tasty.
It's the special dessert stomach that I remember children have when they're full for the main course, but suddenly there's extra space when the pudding comes along.
Exactly. So that's driven by our hedonic system.
Charles, can I bring you in at this point? Is this a physical thing, or is this really more about psychology?
I think definitely a bit of both. I guess as a psychologist myself, I'm sort of more interested in those external factors that may provoke us to eat, such as the smell of appetizing food. When we wander through a train station or a shopping centre, more often than we realise, it's these external cues to energy-dense, great smelling food that suddenly make us think, maybe I will eat, drink one of those things when, before having smelled or seen that external kind of food cue, we weren't really thinking about food at all.
Okay, you mentioned energy dense. That's intriguing. So we're drawn to energy dense?
Yes, and may even have sort of evolved our kind of visual systems to be able to look at a scene and almost instantaneously decide if there's something edible out there. And if so, what's the most energy dense, highest fat food? And then our brain kind of immediately pays attention to that. And if that food is in movement or in motion, it's even more attractive. And this is something I think that the food marketeers have sort of intuitively picked up on, showing those pictures, of oozing cheese coming out of a burger, say, or a slice of pizza or lasagna. And that just becomes something that's a very powerful cue that draws our attention that we can't ignore, and which then sort of prompts us or provokes us to order or to eat more than we otherwise might.
Well, you've touched already on the food cues that we see that come into us, and I want to bring in a listener question at this point. A listener who wonders what happens when you add some entertainment into the mix.
Hi, Crowd Science. My name is Adenike Glenn. I am from Nigeria. I live in the UK. My question is, does watching TV and eating at the same time affect the intensity or taste of food flavors? I think I taste my food more when I am not watching TV. Is it possible that the part of the human brain that is responsible for taste and the part responsible for vision conflict when they are functioning at the same time? Thank you.
Charles, this is right up your street for your lab studies, right?
That's right. Sort of laboratory and real-world research from a variety of countries now shows that if we're distracted, and television can be a great source of distraction, then we don't really tend to pay attention to what we're eating. And as the listener mentioned, she doesn't think that the food tastes as intense when the TV's on, and that's exactly what the research shows. And that is really worrying, because it seems like we don't wait for our stomach to expand and tell us that we can't take any more food in, because that would take tens of minutes after we were actually full for our brain or our stomach to signal that. But instead, we kind of use the number of food sensations that we have consumed as kind of a guide or a proxy to say when we should stop eating. And so if you're attending to your food, if you're very mindful about the raisin you're eating, you get more sensations and you will be satisfied with less. And it depends, of course, on the TV show, but it can be as much as 30% more food is consumed by people when watching the TV than when the TV off.
Wow. And
today, I suppose it's not just the TV, it might also be your smartphone. People on average will eat 14% more food because they're distracted by their mobile device.
Christine, can I bring you in here distraction? I'm just wondering what sort of eating whilst not really focusing on the food might do if we're focused on the TV.
If we're distracted, then we're not in tune with our hunger and fullness levels. So we might just be mindlessly eating. We're not paying attention to the food that we're putting in. We're not paying attention to how our stomach is feeling, because we are distracted by the TV that we're watching.
Now, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Christine. Moving on to a question about planes. So let's hear from Ian in the Wirral.
Hi, Crowd Science. My name is Ian from the Wirral in the UK. My question is about food. Whenever I fly, the food always tastes bland. Why is this? And do astronauts have the same problem?
OK, thank you, Ian. Now, it turns out I was flying just the other day, so producer Mel sent me off to the airport with 3 small bags of popcorn with different seasonings: salty, umami and plain. I was instructed to taste test them on the ground at the airport, then again once I was airborne. OK, I'm at the airport. Savoury salty. Well done, Mel. I don't know what that is, but it's good. OK. Bag B. That's the palate cleanser. I think that's just plain popcorn. Bag C. Delicious. Also very salty. OK, I need to go and get on a plane now. OK, I'm midway through my flight, so it's time to crack open the snacks again. That's A, which is still delicious but slightly less salty than it was on the ground. That's B, which tastes even more of nothing. No offence, Mel. And this is C, which is, I think, the saltiest of the 3. Still good.
I wish you a very safe and pleasant on the journey, and we'll hopefully see you in flight with us again very soon. Thank you.
I marked down the flavours out of 10, and I did notice that the plain and salty popcorns both went down a mark in the air compared with on the ground, whilst the umami, the savoury flavoured one, stayed as delicious as it was on the ground. So, Charles, what's going on? You've looked at this specific issue, haven't you?
That's right. I think the environment in the air is very different from the environment on the ground. And there are probably 3 factors that can change the taste and the flavour of what we eat and drink in the air. And those are, kind of the lowered cabin air pressure, which is typically around what you'd get at about 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. It's also the very dry cabin air, equivalent to what you might get if you were eating in the desert. And for me, the really interesting one is the sound of the plane's engines, which normally are coming in at about 80 to 85 decibels of background engine hum. And research has been done to show that salt and sweet are suppressed by about 30%, our rating of their intensity in food and drink, when we're in the presence of that background noise. Whereas the mysterious 5th taste of umami, kind of the proteinaceous taste that you can get by adding MSG, monosodium glutamate, to foods, that turns out to be enhanced in the air as a result of the background noise. Food providers have to add 20 to 30% more sugar and salt to an airline meal, such that it will taste the same up there as it does to panellists tasting down on the ground. That's got health consequences, of course. And then the other thing that's really interesting to me was why it is that there are so many people out there who drink tomato juice or Bloody Marys on an aeroplane. Especially when surveys of thousands of flyers show that there are a quarter of the population who will only drink or order tomato juice Bloody Mary in the air and never think about doing so on the ground. And you want to ask what's going on there? Well, tomatoes are a very rich source of umami. The Worcester sauce that might go into a Bloody Mary is another rich source of umami. And so I think what's happening is that people are almost self-medicating in the air by ordering a drink that will stand up to the noise and the change in pressure in the air versus on the ground. And that observation, I think, should be used by some of the food providers in the air to offer us not just a salt and pepper sachet with our airplane meal, but also a little MSG shake. 5th taste shake, some call it, would be a great way to help enhance the taste without necessarily having the negative consequences of having to add more sugar or more salt.
Airlines want you to enjoy your meal, so flights can be long and tedious, and a decent meal makes a happy customer who might come back for more. And Charles, you've worked with a chef to design special aeroplane food, and Never one to miss out on a meal, I went to sample some high-altitude treats.
So I'm Joseph Yousef. I'm the founder and chef patron of Kitchen Theory. We are an experience design studio based in North London, and a lot of the work that we do is based on research where we look at the multisensory and psychological relationship that people have with food in different settings. So that could be schools, care homes, hospitals, at people's homes, and of course on board aircrafts.
Joseph, we're in your test kitchen in North London, and you've just put a plate of something unfeasibly delicious looking in front of me. This is airline food, isn't it?
Well, when you're on an airplane at 35,000 feet, you've got quite a few kind of sensory obstacles to get through in order to really be able to appreciate flavour and taste. And so this dish here is set to perhaps address, or this little taster here, I should say, is perhaps set to address some of those issues.
Talk me through the elements. What is this?
So you have a blue corn crispy tostada made with Mexican corn. Then you have some jackfruit, which has been cooked in a Oaxacan mole, which is a very kind of rich and deeply intense sauce that has about 32 different ingredients in it, among them chili and chocolate, so quite an intense and rich flavour. Most importantly, it's kind of full of umami. Then you have some little lime and onion pearls, those little pink balls that will kind of pop in your mouth. They have some onion and lime in them, so quite fresh and clean. And then you have this very nice fresh coriander to top it off with.
I'm not sure I can put this in one. I'm going to do this. It's delicious, obviously. Do I have mole around my mouth? No. Because I made a bit of a pig's ear of eating this. It's really savoury. It's delicious. Really crunchy. Mm-hmm. Is that deliberate?
Yeah, so, you know, when you're in a really noisy aeroplane and that is kind of inhibiting your senses in some way, what we want to do is really dial up all the other senses, and texture is really important. We know that people like crispy, crunchy, crackly types of foods, and that we find them satiating and comforting. And this crisp here not only gives you that satiety in the bite and the crunch, but also in the sounds that you're hearing as you're crunching, and that's also good to be able to amplify that while you're on the airplane. Then you have the jackfruit that's bringing in that kind of umami hit, because the sound of an engine is at about 70 decibels, and what that means is it suppresses your ability to perceive saltiness and sweetness. So that typically makes food taste a bit blander, but we know that the sound level doesn't affect umami in the same way, and so that's why we chose this mole sauce, to really give it a rich, intense flavour in the mouth, some way compensate for the lack of kind of saltiness or maybe sweetness that you're getting through. Then the little pearls are there to just give these little bursts of flavour. Again, it's all about textures, keeping the mouth engaged, keeping making us mindful as well of what we're eating. So that's why you want a variety of textures in there. You want to use foods that really are quite pungent in some way to kind of cut through the dullness of the senses that you have when you're on an aeroplane. And there's something entertaining about the format. The presentation looks quite visually appealing, and that's really important. I think there's also that stigma around airline food looking quite unappealing in the trays that it's served in, and what you're looking at there is much more colourful.
You're looking at bringing out certain flavours. You're looking at making it visually appealing. What about our smell? What about our hearing? Can we engage all of the senses with this?
On board aeroplanes, one of the other ideas may be noise-cancelling headphones could work pretty well. And perhaps even nasal spray to clear the sinuses before eating.
OK, that was delicious. Thanks to Joseph Yousef at Kitchen Theory. Charles, I'm intrigued by this idea that you can combat the dulling of your taste buds by putting on noise-cancelling headphones. Can you do more than that?
We've worked with a number of the airlines on introducing music, or what we call sonic seasoning, to try and help enhance the taste of the dishes once we've taken out that background noise. You pick some music with tinkling, high-pitched sounds that can help to bring out the sweet taste in food without the need to add more sugar.
I had a listen to Sour, and it's amazing. It really made me think of lemons.
The Sour one, yeah, that's one of my favourites. That's really sort of powerful. I love having groups of children at sort of science demonstrations and giving them like a Sour Patch Kids sweet and letting them start to eat it, and then putting on this sour, dissonant, again, sort of high-pitched music. And you can almost see their faces pucker up as they found the sourness really, really intense.
Charles, you sent us some of the sonic seasoning, devised music based on research that suggests that certain sounds can alter or enhance the intensity of flavour. So let's hear a couple of musical tasters. Let's hear Sour. Okay, let's hear Sweet. Let's hear Bitter. Thank you, Charles. We've been talking about aeroplane food, which leads us quite neatly to this thought experiment from listener Jagmohan.
Hi, Crowd Science. My name is Jagmohan Rathi, and I live in Ghaziabad, India. I have a question about food on aeroplanes. Assume a plane weighs 1,000 kilograms. Add 100 kilograms of food and beverages. So the total weight on takeoff is 1,100 kilograms. The food and beverages will be consumed once airborne. The question is, will the weight of the plane increase, decrease, or remain the same? Can you please help unravel it?
I can't personally, but I know a man who can. Ruben Meerman is by background a physicist, but he became obsessed with this question of where the weight of food goes and went on a biochemistry deep dive.
It wasn't until I lost some weight myself and stood on the scales, that's when I first thought, wow, what happens to that weight that you lose? Where does it go? Out of which orifice in my body did those atoms escape me? So the first thing that will happen to the meal is you'll digest it, which means you'll break big molecules down into much smaller molecules that you can then absorb into your bloodstream. And then all those molecules will end up in cells, and you'll slowly then metabolize them. And what that really means for food is that you'll turn all of that food into carbon dioxide and water. And for the protein part of a meal, you get carbon dioxide and water, plus a little bit of urea, which ends up in your urine, and a tiny bit of sulfate, which also ends up in your urine.
But those molecules in food have mass, and energy doesn't. And isn't the food turning into energy? So where does all that stuff go?
You don't turn food into energy. You can't do that because it's made out of atoms. And the only way you can turn an atom into pure energy, so that there's no more mass left, you'd have to have antimatter atoms to annihilate those atoms with. And that's completely plausible physics-wise, but it's not what happens inside the human body. While you're sitting there digesting your meal and then metabolizing it slowly, you are literally just converting it into gas and water, and you slowly breathe out the gas, and the water mixes in with your body water, and you'll slowly lose that as well. So for the first, hour or so after you've eaten that meal, you haven't really done much to it yet. You're breathing the whole time and slowly getting lighter. But if you're sitting on a plane not doing much, you're not doing that very quickly.
So Jagmohan gave the example of a 100-gram meal. Can we say how much of that goes where?
Oh, yeah. So this is where I got very excited and did the maths on this. If you have 100 grams of carbohydrates, out of that 100 grams, 75 of those grams will come out of your lungs as carbon dioxide, and 25 of those grams become water. We are all just sitting there constantly vaporizing our food. The other thing to take into account here is how fast your body turns food into carbon dioxide and water. And at your resting metabolic rate, when you're just sitting still, for every kilogram of your weight, you will breathe out about 1.4 milligrams of carbon per minute. That doesn't sound like much, and it isn't much per minute. It's good to know these numbers, by the way. So if you just stand up and start doing something like, combing your hair, because you're using your leg muscles and you're moving your arm muscles to comb your hair, you'll be breathing 250%, 2.5 times more air per minute than while you were sitting still.
Good tip for speeding up your metabolism. Stand up. But back to our plane. Is it losing weight?
The plane definitely is losing weight all the time. It's not very much compared to the weight of the plane, but every living human being, every living animal is constantly breathing out carbon dioxide and slowly losing weight. And, we've known this since the 1500s. We didn't know what the weight loss was, but a famous physician called Santorio Sanctorius, every doctor learns about him. He was the first person to ever weigh his own weight, the weight of a meal that he consumed and whatever beverages he drank, and then he'd sit on a steel yard, it's like a balancing beam, and just watch his weight over the course of a few hours, and he noticed that he was losing weight all the time. But when he weighed all the excrement that came out of him, he couldn't account for all the weight that he had eaten, so he put the missing part of the weight that was disappearing out of him, he called that insensible perspiration, and just assumed that it was all water. It took another 100 years or so before carbon dioxide was discovered by Joseph Black, so he had no idea that what's actually happening is you're breathing out the carbon atoms in the food that you eat constantly. You can't stop it. If it ever stops, that's a medical emergency. We are all losing weight, and it is appreciable, and you can measure it over time, but compared to the weight of everything else in that plane, it's just such a small number that it wouldn't really make any difference.
Thanks, Ruben. So if a plane has 100 passengers and they weigh on average 70 kilograms, that crowd are going to be losing 9.8 grams per minute. More if anyone wriggles in their seat or gets up. Those grams are going into the cabin air, so if we're being really pedantic, it's not actually lost until it's replaced by fresh air. I don't think this is going to help save fuel costs or save a carbon footprint. I love that our listeners ask these kind of questions. I mean, I know that we turn our food into energy, but it never occurred to me that the mass, most of that floats out of our mouth as gas.
Or the other end.
Yes.
Or the other end.
Exactly. But yeah, no, I completely agree. It's very insignificant numbers we're talking about here in the context of an airplane.
Now, listener Ian, who we heard from earlier, who'd asked about flavour perception, we've been talking so far about flight, but he also mentioned other high-altitude activities. What happens to astronauts' sense of flavour and experience of food? Christine, is it important that in that specialised environment that food is something that makes them hungry, not just nutrition?
I think it's important for them to enjoy the food that they're eating, to make sure that they eat enough to sustain their energy expenditure up in space, because they need to make sure that everything's so regimented, and they need to make sure that they eat enough to sustain their energy needs. And when food is more flavorful, then we enjoy it more and we tend to eat it more. But when we think in the context of astronauts, then yes, palatability will be important in that context.
And Charles, is that food, is enjoyable food something that needs to be specially designed for space?
I think it most definitely does. But nowadays, as we're starting to think about long-haul space flight, say to Mars and back, suddenly the question about how to make food desirable to the astronauts in that special environment. Christine's right that the food that's sent up into any space mission is very carefully calibrated to have exactly the required nutritional composition and balance. And yet what's been observed is that this phenomenon called space anorexia, that many astronauts come back having lost weight even though they've been sent up into space with exactly the right amount of food to maintain their status. And this is a real cause for concern, especially for those long-haul space flights where if astronauts don't eat enough for months or years, then what might happen to their health is a question that the space agencies have been grappling with recently. And I think part of the problem may be one of space anosmia, which is the fact that under those low gravity conditions in space, the blood in our body starts to collect in our head rather than moving towards our feet. And that can block up the nasal passages, meaning that for at least some part of a space trip, astronauts may not be able to smell the food at all. Most of what we think we taste is really coming from the sense of smell, as the rich volatile aromas pushed out from the back of the nose as we eat and chew. Then if that's missing, that might help to explain why the astronauts just don't eat their meals. And when you add to that, the way the food is presented, I think it's really important. It's certainly important on the ground, how food looks, what we call it. My favourite example of that, even on the ground, would have to be how sales of Chilean sea bass increased by 1,200% when that name was given to the fish, rather than Patagonian toothfish, which was what was on restaurant menus before. And that simple act of naming doesn't change the food, but it can change how appetising it seems.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Christine. Now, let's stick with the subject of flavourings and bring things down to earth. So we've heard throughout the show about the importance of seasoning to our enjoyment of a meal. But is this a uniquely human trait?
Hi, Crowd Science. My name's Flick and I live in Surrey in the UK. My question for you is about seasoning food. I was wondering whether humans are the only species who mix food and season for flavour and taste preferences rather than for any nutritional benefit. Or are there other animals who do this too? Thanks.
Now, in our search for answers, we came across birds that hang grasshoppers on stakes to detoxify them, and several species that use the sun to cook their food. But over in Kashima Island in Japan, there's a group of monkeys that go a bit further. They wash their food, sweet potatoes, before eating them, and this behaviour was first observed in 1953, and researchers have continued to observe the monkeys who do it. Mr. Takashi Funahashi, who's a zookeeper in charge of Japanese monkeys at the Japan Monkey Centre, says this is thought to be an example of culture in the group of monkeys, and he told me the story of the first monkey, a female, who started the behaviour.
A female monkey got a sweet potato and she accidentally dropped it at the small stream. She picked it up and ate it. This washed potato may have tasted better without sand. Since then, she washed sweet potatoes at the stream. Then this behavior spread to other monkeys. First, her mother and siblings, and then it spread to the entire troop. During the course of transmission through generations, monkeys started to carry the potatoes to the sea. They washed the potato and ate, and again dipped the potatoes into the seawater and ate it. Their motivation might have been to get the salty taste, which may have increased the sweet taste of the sweet potatoes.
So, monkey see, monkey do when it comes to washing potatoes, which makes sense. I also prefer my potatoes without grit and cooked in salty water. We have a lot of learned listeners, so actually this is a point where I'd like to put a call out to anyone who knows of any other animal that goes out of its way to make its food more delicious, because if you've come across something, I'd like to know. And we're coming to the end of this show. It just remains for me to thank our guests, Charles Spence and Christine Beaulieu. And all this talk of flavouring has me wondering. So if I dropped you both on your own desert island with one item to help flavour whatever you scavenge, what would it be? Christine?
I absolutely love the flavour of raspberries. So if I could have the flavour of raspberries with me wherever I go, I would love that.
Consider it done. Charles, what about you?
For me, it would have to be chili. I absolutely love that sort of fiery burn of spice that does season many a food. That is my kind of comfort taste, strangely. And also seems to have, from the latest evidence, health benefits. The more chili we eat, the longer we live.
Ah, that's great. Okay, well, a crate of hot sauce is being dumped with you. So thanks to Charles and Christine, but also thanks to our listeners for asking such great questions. And I have a favour to ask. If crowd science is your favourite flavour of podcast, can you rate us wherever you find your podcasts? So thanks to you in advance for doing that. That's it from me. Just time to hand back to our inquisitive listeners to read the credits.
That's it from this edition of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service.
This week's question was from me, Jacqueline, in Toronto, Canada.
And from me, Flick from Surrey.
And from me, Jagmohan Rati from India.
And from me, Ian from the Wirral.
The program was presented by Marnie Chesterton
and produced by Melanie Brown and Hannah Fisher.
If you have a question, please email crowdscience@bbc.co.uk.
Thanks for listening.
Bye. Bye.